When I was contacted by Dr. Harry, she requested me to discuss some issues from a phenomenological perspective, particularly Husserlian perspective as well as Heideggerian perspective on language. I was a bit hesitant initially because though I have done my research work on phenomenology of Husserl, but it was mostly focused on his approach to the social world, particularly via the writings of Alfred Schutz and all. That's where Merleau-Ponty, Alfred Schutz and all. That's where I focused on my PhD research. Not so much on the question of language, etc., which figures in Husserl's particularly early work in logical investigations, which is actually from where Husserl takes up the whole issue of meaning and as well as his engagement with Frege and all you can see there. Whereas the kind of work which I was doing was mostly on his later philosophy on crisis of European sciences and others. Of course, there also you can definitely read a philosophy of language, which Husserl builds up meticulously. One important point that you need to keep in mind when we talk about Husserlian philosophy of language is that philosophy of language was not the primary concern of Husserl, unlike the analytic tradition. He was led to it because of his interest in logic, when particularly he was engaging with logical investigations. Because at that time, not only Husserl, even before him, Bolzano, Frege around the same time, they were all concerned with the predominant mode of doing logic, particularly the psychologistic kind of approach to logic. And Husserl too was fighting against that mode of philosophizing on logic. So, like Frege, Husserl also attacked psychologism in logic. And it was through this attack on psychologism that Husserl found it necessary to address the issues of meaning, reference, and his entry into language. That's one point you have to keep in mind. So, when you look at Husserl's philosophy of language, keeping this in mind, you will see that one of the important differences between the analytic tradition flowing from Frege and others, of course, and Husserlian tradition, phenomenological tradition, is that the role of intentionality which is brought within the whole discussion. I mean, Frege doesn't talk about intentionality, doctrine of intentionality. For Husserl, the theory of meaning as part of a philosophy of language is necessarily, so to say, entangled within the notion of intentionality of consciousness. So, this is one of the important points that you need to keep in mind. Now, when you are, as a philosopher, taking a position within language as well as logic, refuting psychologism, there are few things which psychologism as a philosophical position made easy for philosophers in a way. I mean, I'm just trying to communicate this idea that psychology, of course, has its pitfalls, great pitfalls. That's why philosophers like Frege, Husserl and all were attacking it. One of the central drawbacks of psychologism is that it goes into a kind of unmitigated relativism, that if everything is made, is the process of our thinking, logic is made with reference to our psychological moorings, then each of us, the way we think, can develop our own logic. So logic becomes subjective, it loses its objectivity. So that's one of the central problems with psychologism vis-a-vis logic. And this is something Husserl could, like Frege, couldn't digest. But the advantages of psychologism, particularly in philosophy of language, is that it could explain the link between meaning and, so to say, the act from the perspective of, or from the side of the subject, the utterance, the expression. How expression which the subject utters gets linked with meaning, which is sort of objective, etc., can be explained in terms of the psychological underpinnings of human speech expressions. So when you are attacking psychologism and raising it as a issue within the domain of logic, you lose this advantage. And you can see this glaring gap in Frege, because Frege becomes silent about, though he uses the metaphor of grasping the sense. You know, the metaphor of grasping is something which Frege uses. He doesn't explain how it happens that the sense, which is objective, is grasped by the subject. That he just brushes by saying that sense is grasped, that's all. But Husserl, the advantage of a Husserlian philosophy of language, I would say, following interpretations of Barry Smith and even Mohanty, Jane Mohanty, and many others, is that Frege could, Husserl could show us how the objective meanings are linked with the subject's utterances. And logical investigation, the 6 investigations, if you examine, the very first investigation with the title Expression and Meanings addresses this issue. But it's a complicated route which Husserl takes in order to explain how this linkage happens. So the advantage of phenomenological philosophy of language from Husserlian perspective, I would say, consists in addressing this linkage problem which Frege was silent about. Of course, I'm not going into the minute details which Husserl sketches in his logical investigation between expressions and indication, and these are some of the issues which later phenomenologists like Derrida and all took up against Husserl. I'm not going into that, nor I am competent to discuss Derridean attack on Husserl in a very deep manner. Though Mohanty, for example, tried to show in some of his writings that the Derridean attack is not so justified vis-a-vis Husserl's understanding of expression. Now let's see how this, as I have sounded, this linkage between sense and the subject's acts, what you call the act matter. Husserl, again, many later, writers have interpreted Husserl's theory of meaning in terms of his notion of noema. For example, Dagin Follasdal is one who first interpreted Husserlian noema as akin to Fregean sense or sin. That's a possible way of reading, though again some writers like Sokolovsky as well as even Mohanty, though admits that the closest to Fregean sin sense in Husserl is noema, but it is again not the same as Fregean sin. However, if you look into, if you latch on to this notion of noema, which is expressed in his subsequent writings, after you won't find the term noema in logical investigations. It comes in his works like the formal and transcendental logic and then ideas and all. So what actually noema was in his earlier writing was something which Husserl talked about as an ideal species, the meaning as an ideal species. So the ideal species which is objective, so an expression, a speaker, a subject, when he utters, he gives vent to an expression which has a meaning. The meaning is equivalent to what Husserl calls in logical investigation as the ideal species. At the same time, as Husserlian phenomenology throughout in its development of various stages of development shows the act of consciousness also has an objective side to it, an objective pole. So from the perspective of ideas, or or even other works, later works, subsequent to logical investigations, you can see that the doctrine of intentionality is explained in terms of having a noetic act side and a noematic object pole. Of course, there are again various interpretations of this. In phenomenology, what is generally come to be known as the East Coast school versus West Coast school of thought. Led by people like Sokolowski and all, would oppose this reading of Forrest-Dahl's version. Anyway, so that minute again interpretations I am not entering into. It's something which those who are interested in Husserlian phenomenology of language can work at length. As I told you, my issue is, or the point that I am trying to flag is, what is the mechanism through which Husserl projects this linkage between a subjective act of uttering something ending up objectively as an ideal species of meaning. Now this problem, as I told you earlier, Frege and subsequent, Frege left it untouched, but subsequent analytical philosophers, for example Wittgenstein, they found that this gap is there very much. So, for example, Wittgenstein's later writings, he addresses it by linking it to a much more foundational institution called social institution. One interpretation, there may be other interpretation also. David Bloor and all would read Wittgenstein's sociologism there. So linking this act of expressing meaning, etc., as a form of rule-governed behavior, which is a sociological aspect. So in other words, what I am trying to say is that what Frege saw, what Frege failed to see and what Husserl saw was later taken up by subsequent analytical philosophers. So you should give credit to Frege for, Husserl for addressing it right at the beginning of his discussion on language. Now, how does this ideal species, which is objective, emanate from something which is a speaker's, something like a speaker's utterance? Now, for this, Husserl says, here you have to again bring in Husserlian mereology, his discussion about the relation between whole and parts, which is there again in logical investigations. One of the investigation is dedicated to the discussion of the relation between whole and parts, and it's nothing new. Every philosophy, including our own philosophers, Vaisheshika, for example, they talk about the relation between whole and parts, how it can be, and various other. It's a philosophical problem which every philosopher tried to address. But the novelty or the uniqueness of Husserl's approach is that he has envisaged that this relation between whole and parts may happen in other words, it's a nuanced discussion that Husserl carries out in logical investigation. He says that when you look at the relation between parts and whole, there are certain parts which cannot exist on its own, or in other words, they are dependent on the whole. So this kind of parts, Husserl's terminology is moments, as against what may be called pieces, which are separated. Now the moments which are a part which cannot be detached, a part which cannot exist on its own, but only within the locus of a whole, can also happen with other parts. In other words, there can be two parts which are mutually dependent, or it could be even one-sided dependence, but it can be even mutual dependence. Both, for example, Husserl in logical association gives examples like color and extension. Color and its extension. It cannot exist. Color cannot exist without that extended whatever substance or matter or surface. Again, both needs. Or if you invoke the Vaisheshya ontology, it's like guna and dravya. The way they are related. You cannot separate the guna from the dravya. Abstractly perhaps you can do, but as a concrete act, you can't. So this notion of the relation between whole and parts, in terms of moments, gives the space for Husserl to link the act matter, which is the subjective component, which in that way is, has certain, of course, traces of the domain of the mental, with the ideal species or meanings, by saying that the way in which this binding together of parts within a whole, Husserl, as Smith notes, Barry Smith notes, it was a very novel conceptual move that Husserl made by showing that expressions have act parts which cannot be separated from language or meanings. They cannot exist on their own. They are, in other words, dependent. It's a moment. So this is the binding. And here one may wonder, I mean, see, even in Frege you can see certain notions of a part playing the completion of sense. For example, when Frege talks about saturated and unsaturated expressions, that relation in a different way you get. But the point is that in Husserl, this sort of binding is taking place across distinct categories. So to use the locution of Barry Smith, it is like a trans-categorial, so to say, like we said, transdisciplinary, it is a trans-categorial kind of a saturation that is taking place. So something which has the traces of the mental. So to put another locution, it would be like saying that there is an element of the mental as well as the linguistic, the objective in meaning, which are bound. But then you cannot say that one is prior to the other. It's like a relation where both coexist. If remember correctly, Smith uses the expression trans-categorial instantiation. That's the word he uses. Anyway. So basically the idea is that when we think of an object, the object is in the actual world, the physical object. When we are thinking about it in Husserlian phenomenology, we have an act, noetic act, with a component which Husserl later calls as noema, or earlier it becomes the ideal entity. This ideal entity and the noetic act, two different categories, they are bound in this relation of whole and parts, as it was explained later, later in logical investigations, as moments which cannot be separated. So that material may be a wrong term, that binding, if you look at it, is a trans-categorial binding, but Husserl says that it is not that meaning and expression, they are two different entities. It is like saying an expression expresses the meaning, and Paul Ricoeur has another interesting analogy here to drive home the point. In one of his writings, Ricoeur says that it's like a wine press. You know, this pressing of wine out of grapes, it is something which happens from the grape itself, the wine. And it happens only when the press is functional. When it is not in use, a dry wine press doesn't produce the wine. So similarly, language, when you express it, a speaker utters, meaning emerges, meaning is there. It comes. It's not an external relation, in other words, it's something internal. But it is when it is being utilized, when you utter something. So this predominance of utterance, that is again a point which Derrida, in his speech and phenomena work criticized, who said this priority to speech over against writing, etc. So basically this is the scheme that I wanted to draw your attention to when you discuss. The consequence of all this move is that in Husserlian phenomenology, philosophy of language comes within the ambit of intentionality. And this intentionality cannot be even naturalized, unlike the move which Searle and others try to do it. So that is the lesson that I wish to take from Husserl's maneuvers, from logical investigation and so on. Now when you come to Heidegger, of course, there are many who have worked on Heidegger sitting here, I know. But I would say that, at least in Being and Time, Heidegger more or less followed this notion of meaning in Husserl. Only thing, he extended it to a larger domain. It was not merely the domain of communication or language, but the whole notion of existence, the sign as a being in the world. But then you can see Heidegger acknowledging this notion of sense. He even uses the word sin there. And how he shows that it's not merely an act of speech or utterance, but the human existence itself which is meaningful. So he moves from a notion of linguistic meaning attached to propositions and others to a larger notion of existential meaning. That's a major, of course, contribution, but one can show how the germs of that kind of thought is contained in Husserl's writings. But when you come to the Heidegger after the turn, particularly the later works like Poetry, Language and Thought, On the Way to Language, in those works, I think it's a different understanding of language that Heidegger projects. There, for him, language, though speakability is a condition for meaningfulness, it can't be a necessary or it can't be even a sufficient condition for the presence of meaning. It's something, a kind of a mystery if somebody asked Heidegger that it happens. It's something which is given. It happens. It's language. In other words, it's not that man which, or Dasein or man which makes meaning. It's rather the other way. It's language is giving. So that notion of a change you can see in Heideggerian writings. And again, I think it was Ricker again, yes, who has emphasized this point that part of this reason of these two different views, the Husserlian notion of meaning and the later Heidegger's notion of meaning, maybe perhaps maybe traced to another thinker whom both have not discussed much, both Husserl and Heidegger, that is Saussure. His notion of language as having these two dimensions, parole and langue. So when you privilege the utterance, the speech, as Husserl does in logical investigations, utterance, expressions, etc., you are focusing on one dimension of language, the parole. While later Heidegger, when he talks about language as a gift, maybe it is not the parole but the langue sense of Saussure that he is projecting. But in the case of actual language, that which we use, as Ricker shows, we need both. We have to pay attention to both the aspects. So that's in a very sketchy way that I am trying to draw your attention to. I think perhaps as we proceed, we can discuss further and any further discussions here.